Excuse me, could you do me a favor? Could you tell me what the name of this guy is? Ah, thanks. See, believe it or not, I actually already knew that was Pikachu, and chances are you probably know a couple more Pokemon than just Pikachu. But have you ever asked yourself how many Pokemon you actually know, like, from memory? I asked myself this question over a year ago, and after about 6 hours with help from a friend, I got to about 900 before throwing in the towel. That's 900 out of 1,025 current Pokemon, by the way, in case you weren't aware how bloated a task memorizing all of them has become. After that, the idea of getting all of them haunted me, kept me up at night, drove me to sit for hours at a time, turning my brain over before giving up on the last couple that were getting away from me. When I finally did name them all in one sitting, however, I still wasn't content and tried to shave down as much time from my record as possible. That leads us to now, where after so many attempts and so many failures, I've managed to condense my completion time to just about 29 minutes, which is a huge improvement if I do say so myself. It took lots of practice, and more importantly, a lot of weird tricks to get to that point. So my question is this, would you like to see it? I mean, 29 minutes isn't a ton of time to kill for a YouTube video, so why not just watch the magic happen right before your eyes? This here is pkmnquiz.com, a really handy site that I used for my quizzing purposes. I had no external list or reference or even so much as a plushie out for me to try and scrape answers from if I ever stalled. But I can promise you that doing anything to take away my attention from the screen and keyboard would just not be worth it whatsoever. Just to give a demonstration of how the quiz works so things aren't confusing, once I type in the name of a Pokemon, in this case Meltan, that name disappears and a little sprite of that Pokemon appears in their region of origin. Boom, simple as that. As you can see, things are split up by region, and once you finish a whole box, it becomes highlighted like so. Make sense? Good, now we're moving on. Remember, speed is key. Now, with so many Pokemon to memorize, the name of the game is associations, i.e. creating some kind of easy-to-remember point of reference or mnemonic device or something which will stir the latent knowledge in my brain awake at a moment's notice. Given that the website is already divided up by generation, it gives us a good place to start, but even then, it's still a lot to remember. Gen 1 isn't so bad because, it's the Kanto mods. Whether you want to know them or not, Game Freak is ensured that any Pokemon fan gets a heaping spoonful of Gen 1 nostalgia shoved right down their gullet, so remembering your Pikachus and your Machamps and your Dittos isn't too big a deal. That said, there are many more which have gotten very little love over the years, and which I consequently had a pretty hard time remembering. I can't tell you how many times I forgot about the Paris line, Shelter line, and this freak, among others. This is where my associations come into play. Grouping Pokemon in a given region by their typing makes them a lot easier to remember, especially when there are many of said type, like the fire fighting types of Kanto. Also, has anyone ever noticed how many damn two-stage water type lines are in Kanto? Way too many. You may also be seeing how several slots from other regions are being filled, these being the regional variants of those same Pokemon. These guys don't count as extra, but they do fill out the space, which is just as important. It's crazy to me that so many people consider the Gen 1 batch to be the pinnacle of design for the series that has yet to ever be usurped, which, there are some really good picks in here that stand the test of time, but come on, they were still very clearly getting their footing with some of these. I'm too lazy to make a whole big graphic to prove it, but if you can just remember which Kantomons or their evolutions have either regional forms, megas, or Gigantamax forms, then you could probably get through 3/4 or more of the whole decks, which, again, I'm not going to beat it at horse, but do we need 2 Meowth regional variants and a Gigantamax form? It makes the ones that they just leave behind that much funnier. I think they might have forgotten about Seal and Dugong, which I wouldn't blame them for. But similarly to the regional variants, you'll probably also see that I'm naming a few that are not from Kanto and wondering why. These guys are pretty much all the later evolutions or babies that were added, mostly in Gens 2 and 4 in Kanto's case. I like to clear through an entire evolutionary family all at once so I can pull on this near encyclopedic knowledge rather than consciously limit myself to doing something silly like not naming all the evolutions at once. Come on. The rest of this generation, I'll spare you my commentary and let you watch. Let it jog your own memory and try and count how many you didn't know. So other than a few stragglers I'll get back around to, we're through the first leg and onto Johto now, and would you look at that? A good chunk of it is already done. It is fortunate that a sizable amount of Johto's mons are just babies or further evolutions of Kanto mons. Though, granted, I do really like some of them. Unfortunately, the Pokemon that fall outside of these bounds were really, really hard for me to remember, and I had to dedicate a lot of practice to just Johto. Funny, considering it's one of the smallest regional decks in the series. I know there are a lot of Gold and Silver fans out there. I loved Heart Gold, Soul Silver, so I say this with love. A lot of these Pokemon stink and are super forgettable. Snubble and Gramble, Chinchou, Lantern, Sunker, and Sunflora, Quillfish, they're all very forgettable, in my humble opinion. It doesn't help that many of them have no future evolutions or babies, which is helpful in remembering a few Johtomons like Mantine, Murkrow, Apom, etc. Now, I'm not a mindless hater or basher, but I can see why this region in particular was so hard for nearly everyone else that I've shown this quiz to get through. That and the newest ones just due to their recency. I'll finish the section on Johto with something positive though. The Battle Frontier is cool. I think by the time I get to Hoenn, you can see some patterns forming both in the kinds of Pokemon each region has and my approach to naming all of them. Usually, though not always, each generation has some variant to archetypes like the early bugs, birds, and rodents, Pikachu clones, which I did all of at the beginning, pseudo-legendaries, fossils, and such. So by recalling each region's version of those, you can get a nice piece of the decks out of the way right off the bat. Similarly to Gen 2, I wasn't the most intimately familiar with Hoenn's native Pokemon, which is an issue since there are a lot of guys here to recognize. I try to remember all the ones that Mega evolved since Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire gave a lot to work with. Options include Mawile, Sableye, Aggron, Absol, Altaria, Manectric, Medicham, and more, but there were a lot I had to just brute force memorize, like Gulpin, Swalot, Barboach, Wishcash, Corphish, and Crawdaunt. I also came to really appreciate Hoenn's native Pokemon a lot more. You can say what you will about their balance or viability, or how a lot have this weird special physical stat stratification. But as far as design goes, I think this is honestly one of the best batches they've ever concocted. I mean, being the generation to introduce abilities and double battling already gives you huge points in my book. Like without either of those mechanics, you just wouldn't have competitive Pokemon in anything close to its current form, which maybe you think would be positive, I don't know. But these mons are honestly just the cherry on top of all that. I have to confess that I have only played Oras and not any of the original Gen 3 games, so my experience on it is a bit skewed, but I don't think that really comes to affect my perception of the Pokemon themselves. At least not just flatly their designs. Maybe I would have had an easier time remembering some of them if the game they were featured in was a little harder too, you know? It doesn't apply to many of them, but there's a handful of Pokemon that are seared into memory just by virtue of how much I struggled against them at some point or another, such as your Whitney Miltanks or your Elisa Molgas and the like. As a side note, I hope it's not too frustrating watching me pause for a second to collect my thoughts while you're screaming into your screen something like, it's Luvdisc, just please type Luvdisc. When you're in the hot seat, you simply can't have these thoughts, or else you'll croak. Okay, on to Johto's bum cousin, Sinnoh. Like before, the number of evolutions or baby mons total nearly a third of Gen 4's regional decks, but also like Johto, those stragglers happen to escape my memory plenty of times, which is an experience not at all helped by having played Diamond and not Platinum. First, there are a lot of poison types here, so Stunky, Skuntank, Drapion, Scorpy, Toxicroak, and Croagunk are in the bag. There are a few megas to look out for, but those Pokemon, Lucario, Lopunny, Garchomp, are already popular enough that they're easy to remember. Again, by looking at our templates, we can check off regional birds, bugs, fossils, and rodents, which, like, I'm aware beavers are rodents, but that doesn't feel right at all. You may also notice that in this and some other cases, I wait to do the starters and legendaries until I've just about finished a region. That's because those Pokemon are so deeply implanted in my brain that I would remember them even if I got directly hit in the hippocampus. They're just scribbled onto my DNA. It runs that deep. Since I'm so familiar with them, I opt to do the last and try to fill in the middle, the less immediately memorable mons as fast as possible to keep my momentum going. As I was trying to condense my time, momentum, that proved to be the pretty much biggest differentiating factor between a new record or not. When I would get on a roll and my fingers were just blazing name after name. It felt crazy. It was awesome. My most cherished generation. I know all of the Gen 5 Pokemon by heart. This is just past the halfway point, so I try to burn through all these as fast as possible to give me the momentum going into the end I was talking about a second ago. You know his dex is long, so I split it up into beginning, middle, and end. This is why it helps to be so familiar with these games, because the order of the decks follows the order of the places you can go in the game. And just by remembering, oh yeah, the desert, or oh yeah, the cave, you can get a rough idea of what's next. Doesn't apply to all generations, but it does to this one. These Pokemon are my childhood friends, and they hold a special place in my heart. Or at the very least, I have a super clear memory of getting my ass handed to me by some of them. I know Black and White were controversial for locking you into only using the new Pokemon during the main story, but in this specific instance, it was actually hugely beneficial since it forced the game to use all of its new Pokemon to the fullest, meaning I got to know them all pretty well. It's helpful that this batch has a lot of evolutionary lines that have, I guess, what you can call counterparts or mirrors. Lines like the Magmar and Electabuzz lines that are sort of meant to be mirrors to one another. Ones like in Unova, the Suwaddle and Scolipede lines, or the Gothita and Solosis lines. I mean, just that right there, that's already 12 Pokemon, which is 10% of the region's whole dex. However, there are still a few stragglers who I would ponder on for longer than I should have during certain runs. I'd be sitting there watching the time go up for several grueling seconds, yelling at a single blank space demanding to know who it is, only for it to be Stunfisk or Basculin or whatever. We're also getting into the territory where Pokemon have fewer new evolutions in future regions, so filling out Unova means filling out just Unova plus a few Galar, Hisuian, and Paldeamons as a bonus. It's a bit of a bummer since it means I don't get any freebies going forward, but it also means I can go much faster and just focus on Gen 5. I haven't timed it or anything, but I imagine if while typing out Gen 1 I were to only type the original 151 and not also any future additions, it wouldn't have taken me 5 minutes to do it. In fact, being done here means being over the hill, and the rest is just a mad dash to stay ahead. The native Kalos dex is the smallest of any so far, which Lichten's ZA did not want to make up for, I guess. It's in fact so short that I nearly have memorized by order. I think my only preference usually is just typing finesse, so which words are the most fun to type. Which isn't it weird that there are words that feel fun to type? What's up with that? Is it like that it's satisfying in a tactile way? I don't know. Either way, I find the Colosseum Pokemon pretty dull, and I'm glad there aren't a lot to remember. Here I sort of recall things by row. First row is always starters, then the early mons, bugs, birds, rodents, you know the drill. And so on until the box is highlighted. Really no biggie, and it helps that the legendary lineup is tiny. Legend ZA came out recently, and if it had come out sooner, I would have torn through the Kalos lineup even faster. Like, I haven't even played the game, but just through cultural osmosis, I've seen the new megas, many of which are for these Colosseum mons, and having a mega immediately makes the Pokemon better and more memorable. We know this is objectively true. So Malamar and Pyro's megas made them substantially easier to recall as opposed to earlier on in my attempts. Shock to the system. For whatever reason, over the months of practice I underwent, I gradually started skipping Gen 7 and doing it last instead of going in a perfect chronological order. This is the only time I do this, and as far as I'm aware, it serves no useful function other than saving a single second of scrolling up. But it just feels right, you know? Now, maybe this is harsh, but I think Galar might be second to Johto in worst regional dexes. That could be really controversial, but DK, I just don't like a lot of their designs, especially every single one of their regional variants besides maybe Cursola. That said, there are easy groups I can break things into. Galar has most of the template Pokemon, so a Rodent Duo, a Bird Trio, Bug Trio, Pika Clone, Fossils, Dragon Pseudo Trio, and the like. There are also many single stages clustered right at the end, like Ice-Cube and DD and Stonejourner that I try to knock out. Doing this is my way of freeing up space in my memory, RAM, if that makes sense, since I tend to group Pokemon by their evolution lines. This means Pokemon that don't evolve take up the same amount of space for me as an evolution line with 2, 3, sometimes 4 or more Pokemon, and so getting those single stages out of the way at the start frees up lots of mental room. You also have a couple of evolutions in the Gen 9 DLC, from Grapplock and Clobbopus, who are my insane beasts in TCG Pocket. Then another example of those mirrored evolutions, the Hatena and Impidimp lines. After all that, you're left with only a few patches here towards the beginning of the decks, and these are Galar's forgettables, IMO. Toxtricity is cool, but that's really all I'm gonna give them. Sorry. It's kind of like I said with Hoenn, where I feel like I would have remembered them a lot better if they were actually more prominent in the games where they were introduced. I'm not asking for Gen 5 here, okay, but this is going to seem really petty. Why does a champion of this region not have a Pokemon from said region as his ace? It drives me crazy. They don't have the excuse of, oh, well, they needed them to show off the game's big gimmick and there weren't any new Pokemon that fit like they did with Diantha because there are Galarian Pokemon that can Gigantamax. Not like I care for Gigantamaxing anyways. Maybe this is silly, but I always think a region's champion should embody the strengths of that region, including its Pokemon. People go to war against monotype champions. This is my crusade, my hill to die on. All right. And it's on to the current newest batch from Paldea, which means on to the final good regions. Yeah, looking back, I seem to have a weird pattern of preferring the designs in odd number generations, with Gen 1 barely clinging on, to be honest. Doesn't say much about the games themselves, but let's be real, the enjoyment people get from Pokemon games is heavily tied to, obviously, Pokemon themselves. Still, designs are subjective, so let's get the discourse out of the way. If it helps, I'll list my top 3 faves from the even gens here. Johto, Scizor, Umbreon, and Ho-Oh, popular choices for good reasons. Sinnoh, Froslass, Bastiodon, and Porygon Z. Sad how all the legends and mythics are terrible. Kalos, Aegislash, Delphox, and Dragalge. Yes, this is a good mega, I think. Galar, Dragapult, Corviknight, Hatterene. slim pickings here, I'm afraid. Anyways, I gave Violet a replay not too long ago, so I had some recency bias with the Paldeamons. There were a few associations I came up with, including the Paldean dogs, the Titan Pokemon, the Paldean poison types as well, etc. But when I first started doing this, Gen 9 actually gave me the most trouble, and beyond the starters, legendaries, and a few others I remember from my first playthrough at release, I didn't know any of them. It took me replaying the game to cement them in, on top of, doing the quiz. But even then, I found it so easy to forget several designs, especially Bramblin, but also Capsicid and Scoville and Cyclizar, though I often have trouble remembering all the single stages in this region. Similarly to the legendaries and upcoming Ultra Beasts of Gen 7, remembering the Paradox Pokemon will procure like a third of the dex. Different from the UBs though, Paradox bonds are based on existing species, so knowing those makes it simpler. You could argue that I should list said Paradox bond when mentioning the Pokemon it's based off of, saving them trouble and naming them later, but I don't know if that would matter. In my mind, you're just moving time around. Even then, I know there are 10 past and 10 future, and the future all just have iron in the name. I considered copying the word iron and pasting it here 10 times to save myself an extra second, but I didn't do that. It's a shame they went with the iron prefix for them all, though, as opposed to for the past paradoxes. Slitherwing and Roaring Moon are far cooler than Iron Bundle and Iron Boulder. I am cherry picking though, because Iron Valiant is crazy. Finally, we circle back around and finish with Alola. And here I'm trying to reduce just the number of evolutionary lines to think about, meaning single Evos go first. Delmise, Bruxish, Meanwhile, Pukin and such, very similar to how I did Galar. Then I recall the last of the Sacred Crabs. It wasn't the only animal-based association I could think of. I mean, there are plenty of Pokemon that are based on the same kind of animal, and you can group them in that way, but for some reason, the crab Pokemon just stuck out of my head a lot. After, I begin speeding through the region as quickly as I can go. In this case, I remember the feeling of racing against the clock, only a few moments away from my PR, and in that panic, I ended up starting from the top and trying to go sequentially, or as much as I felt like. It's a shame to rush through so many great Pokemon, though. Sun and Moon are a prime example of the quality of the game and its Pokemon not always aligning. Interpret that as you wish. That said, I really like a lot of these guys. They really hit their stride with the fairy type here, and I don't know, something about the color palettes and the designs is just really appealing. And not to mention the way they play with really interesting and weird concepts, like Pokemon based on Darwin's finches, or one that imitates Pikachu because it's popular, or whatever Pyukumuku is. Introducing regional variants is also a tremendous feat from this region that I'm really surprised they hadn't come up with sooner. I'm always a sucker for seeing Pokemon depicted as animals with a historic genealogy as seen with past paradoxes and megas, but also these regional variants, and in some cases entirely divergent lines, or convergent lines in modern cases. After clearing away the Tapus, Cosmic Line, and other legends and mythics, it's time to round things out with the Ultra Beasts. I said I was really familiar with all legendaries, but these guys aren't legendaries, and also gave me a huge headache. Nihiligo and Stakataka specifically kept me guessing for long enough to kill many runs that came down to just the split second. Not this one, though. There comes to this agonizing silence as I desperately search my memory banks for these last couple of Pokemon, and one by one, they come back to me. After fumbling with the names of a couple more stragglers, I finally do it. I name them all in 29 minutes and 22 seconds. And now that we're through with that, it's time to circle around to the title of this video and ask, is this a world record? The results for something like this show plenty of YouTubers taking a stab at it, but it usually takes them, understandably, a few hours. Otherwise, there just doesn't seem to be anyone putting up a world record attempt, is what I would say, if not for this despicable little shit by the name of Sourish. You see, in the months it took to produce this video, Sourish here decided in October to put up a record that was several minutes faster than my previous time. Meaning, of course, I had to put my beak back to the grindstone and keep trying until I got the sub 30 time you all just saw. However, other than Sourish and now myself, no one else appears to be claiming world record, which makes sense since, as Sourish puts it, who else is doing this? Everyone who saw me doing this kind of thing just regarded me as insane, so that would track. Still, this video will serve as a wider call to see if anyone else would like to step up and give it a swing. Because if no one steps forward, then I'm going to declare myself the world record holder for all time. Or until the next generation comes out anyway. I only did as well as I did on account of a lifetime of residual Pokemon knowledge acting as a foundation, but I'm more than certain it'd be possible to shave this time down further. I want to see how precise it can get if more people keep egging each other on, which is sort of what the internet is best at. That's really about all for me for this one. I'd like to say I can finally rest on it, but not only will I definitely be back when Gen 10 drops, probably later this year, there's also the Chaos mode and Dex Order mode that are both definitely harder. I foresee myself trying to master that one next. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate the reception I got on my previous video. It was very surprising to see it be engaged with so much, and I kind of got overwhelmed from going into the comments and talking, but I am thinking about a similar follow-up-ish video soon anyways, so nonetheless, I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much again, and have a good, wonderful day. Bye-bye.